Today I'm going to be playing a game called Kiloton Black Project, which is a twin-stick shooter. There's going to be some helpful feedback here for the developer themselves, as well as a bunch of insights that you can use if you are developing something similar, and I'm sure there will be some stuff I talk about that transcends genre. We are going to launch the Black Project, whatever that means. I don't know. It's very classified. We're going to play through the tutorial. WAS to move, drag square, bottom left, mobile, okay, left right click weapons, tap butt. So there's some text here that's rendered in the world and it's cut off here. I would probably get people moving around and then wait until they pass a particular point on the screen to bring up this left right click to fire. I don't know which of these to read first, and it would be better presented sequentially, so I only see this, then I only see this, but I feel like you probably know this anyway if you're the developer. QE to fire rig weapons. That's what this is down here, I think. Okay, it's not firing. These are the weapons that correspond to my left and right mouse buttons. There's just a test enemy that's not attacking me. Ooh, that's quite nice. I get some like knockback. Deplete the grey armor bar to stun enemies. Press R to lock on. Okay, so we got no one to test it on up here. This is gonna be a fun game of can doc even complete the tutorial. My favourite game.
Death is likely to occur soon. Report to the nearest bioengineer. Failure to maintain life is a breach of our terms
and will result in employee termination. That's very good. I like that gag. If you die, we will sue you for breach of contract. That's the kind of quality writing you get when you outsource and you collaborate. The flow of having to move around when there's multiple enemies is already feeling pretty good. Press space while moving to boost. Okay, that's cool. Ooh. So I do feel a little bit like this weapon HUD over on the right hand side. It feels like maybe it's just the structure of this particular level, but I'm often moving and firing to the right, and that means that the HUD is in sort of the worst place it could be, this weapon HUD, because often there are enemies underneath it, and I feel like I'm trying to aim at them but also clicking on the HUD with my cursor, which is not ideal. It's sort of obscuring what I'm looking at, and maybe thinking about other places that this HUD can go to. This is really like something that doesn't matter at this stage of development, but it's kind of funny that when I use the menu, the gun is still firing. It's a very small goof, but it is quite amusing. Definitely not game breaking though. It's really funny seeing these enemies called invigilators, because I associate invigilation with being the person in a school or university exam who walks around and checks people aren't cheating, which is the most boring job in the world if you've ever had to do it. If I ever find myself invigilating exams again, I'm gonna cosplay as one of those robots and make robot noises while everyone's trying to concentrate. Closest thing to a twin stick shooter I've played in recent years would have been something like Hotline Miami or Binding of Isaac. But so we got that lock-on feature, which feels good. I kind of feel like if I'm playing this on a mouse, that lock-on feature, it would feel really good if it was assigned to the mouse middle click on the scroll wheel. I know not everyone has a scroll wheel, but it could be kind of an additional way of doing it instead of just having the R button, because then it's very closely associated with the weapons, and I just kind of feel like that would be a very natural mapping for it. I think if you're going to kind of send people right back to the start of the tutorial after each thing, it's going to frustrate them quite quickly. At the moment, the tutorial kind of feels like a proper level with just some instructions layered into it. It also feels like a proper level in terms of like the amount of challenge and the amount of health that these enemies have, and I know I'm probably experiencing it as more difficult because I'm trying to talk at the same time, and I am famously bad at multitasking. I think maybe there need to be some safeguards here or checkpoints so that, you know, players don't get frustrated with how hardcore the game is straight out of the bat before they've even finished the tutorial. I think just, you know, modding some of these enemies to only take 1 or 2 hits, only in the tutorial level, just so that people get that satisfaction of feeling like they're progressing. Definitely if you're going to throw them all the way back to the start every time they fail. A severe threat. This is too much text to show people when something is going to attack them. Like, if there is something dangerous happening that players need to respond to and you're giving them any information in text, it can be like 2 words, you know, verb, noun. Defeat boss, don't die. This, you know, you can have lots of text when we're in a moment like this where the player is not threatened, but I think when it's a warning text, when it's a boss incoming, it really needs to just be 2 words. Threat slain. The severe threat has been... Oh. I didn't get enough time to read it. I still haven't managed to trigger this weapon at the bottom which says it's Q or E to launch, so I might be playing this at disadvantage because I've a weapon that I don't have access to at the moment, but let's just see how we get on. Coming back to the Invigilator thing, I can see they've got Invigilator and Monitor, and I see what they're doing there in terms of the world fiction. You've got these robots that are deadly things, but they've given them quite neutral sounding names as if they're not supposed to be military. You know, they're just watching, they're just keeping a lookout. So one of the things I can already feel that this game is doing very well, making it feel like when I make an error and I get hurt, it is my fault, right? That's like the baseline thing you want people to feel when they play an action game, is that ultimately when they're taking damage, it's because they did something wrong in the last few seconds and they can work out what that is and try and adjust their playstyle. I'm not feeling as if the damage I'm taking is the result of the game being unfair or random or too unpredictable. It is my inability to dodge properly, and that's a very good benchmark for any sort of action game, whether it's a top-down, you know, twin-stick shooter or a traditional shmup or a bullet hell. To have that sense with your playtesters that, you know, the game isn't just being mean to them, they are failing because they know what they should do and they're not doing it right, you know. Uh-oh. It's a big boy. I talked too much about assigning the lock onto the middle click, and now I'm trying to do it, even though it's not actually in the game. It's just... Why haven't you implemented my suggestions yet? I've been playing this game for 5 minutes. Right. I think the can people play the game whilst talking test is also quite an interesting one. Just about can't with this, but that's fine because this is meant to be a sort of challenging game. I think if you're making an action game which is aimed at a very casual audience, then seeing if people can play the game and hold a conversation at the same time is a very good test. I kind of can't here. I imagine people who are very good at this genre would be able to. I am an old man, and my reaction speed is non-existent. I really like the way that all the enemy projectiles are sort of coded to be a similar colour, because it makes it very easy to read the game state on the screen and know what you should avoid. But I do think they could have a couple of things done to them to make them feel urgent. I feel like if all of the, particularly these floating balls, because there is a point at which they stop chasing you and they detonate, and I think having some flashes up to that point would help us to read how close they are to detonation, because when you're just trying to, you know, bob and weave and duck out of the way of them, you're sort of waiting for them to go off so you can turn the other way. I think generally all of these yellow projectiles, if they were kind of going between yellow and white, it would it would make the whole screen a bit noisier, but it's going to make them just read a bit clearer. But I do like the kind of overall sort of visual design ethos that we've got there, where the enemies kind of all have the same color projectiles, making them kind of cycle between that yellow color and a slightly lighter color, just so that they feel a bit more urgent. And then particularly those kind of hovering timer detonation bombs, like having a tell on when they're gonna stop chasing you, basically, I think would be helpful information and would look cool as well. When you're making an action game and you're a solo dev or you're in a very small team like this, you're always looking for things that achieve two things at once. So if you can add an effect that makes things look slightly cooler and also gives the player a little bit more information to go with at the same time, then that's great. Was that supposed to be sort of a mission marker, that yellow thing I just walked over? Not sure. Oh, I'm thinking about the sword mechanic, about this kind of sword dash. Game is sort of generally training me to be risk averse and to stay back from enemies and try and deal with them from a distance. So I don't feel super incentivized to use that sword dash. But I think there's a few things you could do about it, and I think maybe some of it is about feedback and game feel of like I can't see a significant amount of damage happening to the other character, but more importantly, it just doesn't feel like it's connected, you know? If you think of like a Dark Souls game, when you do one of those critical hits, all the interaction kind of pauses for a moment while it clicks. That's really satisfying, and I think if you could get that sort of feeling when you've lanced someone with this melee, it does pay off in terms of damage output. And you can kind of combine it with trying to get away with projectiles. I think it just needs that feeling of connecting and doing some damage. Otherwise, it you kind of feel discouraged from using it. Whoa, whoa. So whenever this grey bar reduces to 0, the enemy is stunned. I think that's the way that mechanic works. That kind of needs clearer communication when it's happening, rather than just being a bar depleting to 0. Because in this sort of situation, in a video game boss fight, it's like, okay, you look at the enemy's health bar, but am I really looking for when that stun drops all the way? And then what am I supposed to do about that? Is the stun an opportunity to do something else? Not totally sure. The way that this kind of armor stun mechanic works, it doesn't feel super intuitive, and I think if I was playing this more casually as an actual gamer and not to analyze it, I think I might just completely miss that whole thing. I think also having it coded as grey might not be the best choice, because it's sort of not super visible when you're playing. I think maybe like a very pale blue or something. I get that we want it to look metallic, and I think you can still achieve that somehow, but I feel like I'm not super aware of that mechanic, and some of it is because there's a color that exists frequently in the background which makes it almost invisible. And on an interaction basis, I just can't see what it's doing. From a player perspective, it's like kind of Halo shield, and when it gets low, that's when I start taking actual damage. Yeah, so it kind of respawns. But I've been told this thing about stunning enemies in the tutorial, and I haven't really seen that play out in a way that I can take advantage of. I quite like that you can lock onto an enemy and then shoot them and hit enemies between you and them. That's cool. And that's a very good way to like have weapons that penetrate through multiple enemies later on, if you can do that sort of thing with the lock-on. I can't beat the first level, but I don't think that's necessarily anything wrong with the game. I think I just suck at this genre. And I did also play it on EX, which I guess is for expert. And I am an expert, but I'm not an expert at not dying in this game. Just gonna take the road less travelled, go and see what's around here. Okay, so we've got a much more open layout. One of the things I do like here is between two levels, we've got a wildly different environment layout. It's a really good way of using limited resources. You know, you only have the time or resources to create one tile set. Really playing around with the difference between levels so that it's immediately obvious to the player that, oh, wow, this is totally different from the last level. That's a really good thing to try and aim to do. An overseer now. Bit more sinister title than a Invigilator or Postgirl Amazon drone. And just for legal reasons, I have to point out here that I do not condone shooting down Amazon drones or attacking them with any sort of melee weapon. It's usually quite hard to reach anyway. Whoa, something's lasering me. Okay, this is very cool, very annoying, whatever that was. But it looks like there's some cool encounter design going on here. This environment of like all of these random bits of ruin now goes from being like a novelty, oh, this is different from the last level, to actually being a functional part of whatever this challenge encounter is. It feels like it gets through that wall a bit quickly. So as soon as I realise what I'm supposed to do, which I assume is try and go around, use those walls to block the lasers, then, oh, actually, maybe it's not even about that. Maybe it's about just skirting around the whole outside of the level. I'm not sure if that big red laser is a boss I need to try and get close to by using the walls, or if I need to just totally avoid that middle path through the level and go around the outside. And I'm not saying any of this is a criticism at this point, because I quite like the fact that this level is not just a repetition of the last one, which was like a death corridor, and now I'm in this situation of like trying to work out how the entire level works. Like the level itself has become a puzzle. So I've got further up through the level this time by going around the edge and just avoiding where that laser hit me, which is you know, you don't get a PhD by not learning from your mistakes. It only took me 2 or 3 times of getting mowed down by a giant red laser to realise that maybe walking towards the giant red laser was not a good idea. And that is why they don't let me into the physics department of the university where they keep the giant red lasers, surprisingly enough. Is this a turn off the giant red laser thing? It looks significant. I don't have a way to interact with it, though. Do you have a game where the environment is kind of abstracted, like it is here? It's a tile set, right? There's not loads of unique assets, and that's okay. We're very used to that as people that play indie games. What it does do from a user experience point of view is as soon as you see something that you haven't seen before, like this, that's got a light on, that's got higher contrast, that looks specially made, it's like, I think this does something, right? Maybe it does do something, but I don't seem to be able to interact with it. I can't shoot it. Nothing comes up when I go close to it. Maybe I've triggered it already and that's why it's gone green. Not sure. That's one of the reasons why games that do have quests and subquests in them often have a thing somewhere telling you Yeah, okay, after I've hit that one, it comes up with shut down the laser, 1 out of 2, and now I know, okay, I've done a thing and I need to go and do it somewhere else. But we don't currently have that. I really like the fact that this game has suddenly pivoted from just being about reactions and responding to threats to suddenly I'm in a level which is a puzzle. I really wasn't expecting that based on the tutorial on the first level, and it's a pleasant surprise. Oh no, I'm being invigilated again. Yeah, maybe a bit more feedback on what's happening there with the healing, because I see my health bar go up, but a bit more of like a sound effect and maybe some sort of visual effect would be good, because, oh yeah, no, I did get it that time. It's a very cool challenge design. There's a thing in the middle that will kill you. You have to go and hit these 2 objective points either side to shut it down. I've done that, but it's not really obvious how that point I had to go to on the map relates to this object in the environment. So, and this isn't a bad problem to have, right? Because it means that the underlying structure of this level, of this big, large-scale puzzle, is good. It's just it's not totally clear to me that that is contributing to completing. But the overall structure of this, of like, I see a big road, I go down the middle, I get Homelander lasered in the face. I do it again. And it, that kind of way that the walls around there and the laser is blocked by them, it initially feels like that's the resolution to the puzzle, is to run all around the walls, and then realizing that doesn't work and having to go and look for these things. I really just like the way that this kind of puzzle organically unfolds. I just need a bit more feedback when I hit these checkpoints to show me what's happening, right? Severe threat. Oh no. It's a sort of Robo-Viking. We get a lot of these where I live in England. Robo-Vikings. Right, so I'm just going to say it. If I restart and that means I have to go back through the process of getting rid of those lasers, then I'm not going to try this level again. Yeah, so there's no checkpointing basically on that laser shut-off thing. That was too long-winded to have to go and do those things through again. Night Eater Ivor. I know him. I'll be the first to admit I don't know a massive amount about anime and the kind of tropes and everything. So in terms of like the things this is referencing culturally, I'm not super up to date on, you know, what is a reference to what. Oh my god, radiation is chasing me now. So yeah, the way that the shield mechanic works with enemies, right? It's like the enemies attacking you sort of incentivizes you to stay away from them, but the shield mechanic means that you don't really want to stay away from them too long, because you have to deal a certain amount of damage in a short window of time to even actually deal any permanent damage to them, right? Because otherwise you just chip away at their shield, it regens, and then you never really do any damage towards killing them. That's a cool dynamic. I like that. I like the way that the combat creates that dynamic. The way that the shield works just really does promote this idea that you have to try and make a significant amount of damage in one pop, otherwise none of the damage sticks. But I can see what that set of mechanics together is doing, right? Is it's creating a particular type of combat where you can't be too risk averse and you can't stay back too much. Multiple things here where small improvements in different areas, they'll combine to be greater than the sum of their parts. So for example, making that melee rush feel better wildly change what this sort of combat feels like. Because when I rush that guy down, I take the armor out way quicker, and then my gun can actually do some damage. Whereas if I just pea shoot him from a distance, I don't get anything. One of the things I'm maybe struggling with most in this type of combat, where I have an enemy that's trying to get close to me, is like, I don't know, maybe just having the camera a bit further out, just so I can read the environment better. A little bit more of a zoom out might be helpful for the player in that sort of situation. Enemies are off screen, or like I'm dashing around and I don't know what environment's over there. That's when it starts to feel like the game is screwing me over rather than my own lack of skill. I just can't see things outside of the camera, you know? It feels like they're centered, but the camera is looking up at the top of their head. Creates a situation where the game feels easier when I'm moving upwards than when I'm moving downwards, because when I'm moving downwards I have less sight ahead. A bit annoying, particularly on this level where the direction of travel seems to mostly be downward. We're just going to hang out here and play Minecraft for a bit. Why am I not getting any resources from... The variation in the way that the different enemies feel to fight is really fantastic. When an enemy appears on screen and I want to know which enemy it is, I do feel a little bit like I'm over-reliant on the name of the enemy in text rather than what they look like. If you look at all of the recent examples of very successful games in this genre of like, you know, Binding of Isaac and Hades, there's a very obvious silhouette to enemies that tells you how they're going to act, and I think there is some of that here, but some of the details like these spikes coming off of this overseer, they kind of muddy it a bit. So I do tend to find I'm looking at the text for the enemy name more than I'm looking at the design. Really love that weird hookshot swing that those guys do. Cool enemy design going on there, that sort of spider swing thing that's happening. Whee! See, I don't understand why this is an overseer robot, right? And it has that harpoon. And a minute ago, I fought another overseer robot that was using a different attack pattern. What's the point in me knowing it's an overseer if the thing that's actually relevant to me as a player is how it's going to threaten me in the moment, right? At that point, when you've got two things that behave very differently from each other, marked with the text overseer, that to me is kind of frustrating and misleading. So contracts, this is our level select, right? This menu, right? I really like this menu. I like the fact that it feels like an in-world interface that the pilots might use. But there's always this trade-off for this kind of thing. I can kind of guess what this means, but I don't know what this means initially. It sort of reminds me of trying to play one of the Pat Labor games in Japanese without being able to read it. And that's what this menu reminds me of. Like, I think thematically it's kind of cool. The other thing is that time and time again on this channel, I'm going to complain about all caps. It does make it slower to read, particularly for people with dyslexia, but for anyone in generally, because the letters are all the same height, people generally struggle to read all caps. It slows you down, and it's a shame because when you're trying to make this kind of mainframe style thing, you do want it in all caps because that's how you really get the flavor of this text. Using the all caps when it's a single button or a header, but when it's a full sentence, it's in sentence case with just capital letters in the appropriate places. I know that's not the most exciting thing to be talking about when we're supposed to be driving a mech around and blowing things up, but it's relevant here. I think the reason I couldn't use my rig weapons is because I was told about them in the tutorial, but I didn't have them assigned. There's so many weapons. So I've just played through loads of content in this game without really trying out the different weapons. And again, a Kessler, I think that's some kind of missile meteorite twin longs. There's a lot of modularity here to what can happen with the player build, right? I've got a reactor, changes my core stats. So basically I've got a build of the game where all of this stuff is unlocked. It's going to be interesting to see how you design this going forward, because I quite like systems when you've got this kind of global modifier on how your character feels to play. It's quite nice when they have a kind of drawback to them, because it looks here like we've got an upgrade tree where the top one is just like the game is now easier because everything is better. And I think Cult of the Lamb does this with fleeces. FTL, Faster Than Light, does it with the ships as well. You unlock a new thing, a modification of some sort, but when you use it, what you are doing is usually kind of playing a different playstyle of the game. So you become more of a tank, but you're more slow, or you get some stealth ability, but you're now a glass cannon, and all of that kind of stuff. I'm not going to really kind of analyze every different thing. I'm just going to pick the one that is best for me to survive, right? Low energy consumption and mediocre performance. Very, very similar to myself, a booster after my own heart. I'm also low energy and mediocre. These item descriptions are fantastic, and one of the things that the lead developer told me about this game is that they are working with a small team. So although this is a solo developer in terms of the art and the code being created by one person, they are getting someone to help them with things like writing. One of the interesting questions I got asked, but when I first started telling people about this project, one of the questions I got asked was, oh, do I have to be a solo developer, or can I submit a game if I'm working in a team? Being in a team doesn't stop you being an indie developer. That's not what independent means in the context of games. Being an independent game developer or an independent game studio means that you aren't beholden to what a publisher wants of you, and you can make what you want. It's nothing to do with you being a solo developer, right? When people think independent means doing things on your own, it's probably because they've listened to too much Destiny's Child. So many different weapons, and I'm not going to have time to play them all, so I'm just going to go for the most ridiculous looking combination. That's like a flamethrower type thing. I think that really kind of obstructs my view a bit too much. I think a helpful kind of way of approaching that would be to have the projectile start smaller and grow. This isn't a programming channel. I am not a programming wizard, but using things like lerps, so that you start off with something at like, you've got its eventual size and you start off with it at 0.1 of that size, and then you kind of stretch it to the size over time. And then maybe, I think, if that's supposed to be like a flame or a smoke effect, having it fade out at the end visually. There are some sound effects choices that feel a little bit squiffy to me. I don't know if you can hear that, but that sounds more like environmental alarm, like something bad is happening in this base, and you know, it doesn't feel like the sound of something shooting. But whoa, just getting chased by random nuclear stuff. And I've got my energy consuming shoulder mounted weapons now, which is what I couldn't access earlier. Oh my goodness. Okay, the difference in the different difficulty levels of the stages is cool, right? It's not like, oh, I've got more content by just adding a modifier to their health bars or anything. There's like genuinely different. So you're basically playing the same location and the enemies are there, but they're not just beefed up. They have like different attacks they've got access to and everything. So that's cool. We've got some projectiles that are stuck. Oh no, they're like they're waiting to, again, having some sort of like visual tick that something is kind of waiting to blow up is maybe good in that scenario. Whoa. It looks like that flamethrower weapon is ignoring armor or something, which I guess makes sense, right? If there's melt all of the circuitry and stuff inside so that it can't function anymore. So it looks like I've actually killed this boss and completed the level, but it seems to be stuck. And now you just hang out. I'm not here to do bug testing, and I'm not bothered by there being a small bug that means that I'm stuck here after I've defeated the boss. Those sorts of bugs are the sorts of things that you just catch the more times people play your game. They're not necessarily bad game design, they're just a thing that always happens because games are hard to make. Okay, I'm going to go with a melee cool lance thing and then a totally different weapon on this side. Okay, so the way the lance works is it has a bit of a delay and then I zoom forward. There really has been a lot of care and love put into making these weapons feel differently. They're not just different stats or different projectiles that come out at different rates. Like the way that this lance controls differently from the first melee weapon I used in the game is really cool. You know, there's always going to be areas where you can add a bit more feedback or a bit more juice to the way things move and animate and everything. Like when I charge it up, it would be really cool if the whole character vibrated, making it so that when you're charging something, your character goes, like I said before, whenever you can add a visual effect that makes the game cool and helps to communicate how a mechanic works, that's one of the best things to focus on. Small improvements in an action game that make a lot of difference. So when I used to teach undergraduate students and they were in their kind of first year, and one of the things I always tried to drill into them was the feature that you've added to your game isn't complete until it has sound and some sort of visual feedback for what's happening. And that can't just be like when something loses health, a health bar in the corner of the screen goes down. It needs to be in the game world. It can't just be like happening around the edges. When you've made loads of games and you're doing quick prototyping, that rule might not apply anymore. But when you're first starting making games, it is a really good habit to get into, is to making sure everything has some sort of little animation or visual effect and a sound effect. You know, this game is really thorough in terms of its implementation of sound. Overall, it's quite a comprehensive set of sound effects. One piece of visual feedback that would help me quite a bit as a player is when one of these things is at 0, just having some sort of red flash around the border of that piece of the HUD, because often I find myself like trying to do an attack and I don't have enough energy, or I've just lost all my shields and I'm not really aware of that. When you're in a critical situation, like you've just run out of energy and you can't boost or use your cool weapons, or your shield's just gone down, I think having a blinking border around these would really help communicate that to the player so they can make those split-second decisions about which buttons are going to work and which buttons aren't going to work. I'm going to go and play that again on an easier level with all my weapons so I can feel good about myself again. So the TR difficulty isn't just like nightmare mode, it's actually a different version of the level for you entirely. And yeah, the layout of the level where you start is different as well. If you're watching this and you're making your first couple of games, then I think that approach of just every interaction in the game should have some sort of visual feedback and some sort of sound effect. It's a really good one to start doing because it helps you to estimate the cost of a feature. And one of the things we're often not good at when we first start making games is knowing how long different things take to do, right? It's like, going to make an MMO with an inventory system and all of this upgrading. One of the things about this game in terms of how ambitious it is you've got like 3 different levels that have different levels of challenge and you've got all this stuff to unlock. Those are, what we would call metagame systems. They're not to do with the moment to moment of the game. They're to do with how do you expand the content so that players want to keep playing and feel like there's variety. We're so used to every game having those things that a lot of people, when they start off making games, they assume that they need to do that, right? So they're like, there's going to be 4 different classes and each class is going to have different abilities and a skill tree. And it's like, you need to do my first action game, my first whatever before you get to that point, right? I don't know enough of the history of this project to know how many games the developer has worked on beforehand. But if this is like the first serious game where they've done all of this stuff in the first game, then that is really impressive. So many weapon variations in this, and I think that's fantastic. But I also think that there are lots of small improvements that could be made here that I've talked about earlier on in the video that are things that maybe should have been dealt with before all of this extra content was made. In an ideal world, we'd be very practical and we'd do things in a specific order that made the most sense. But often when we're doing game dev as a hobby, it's very hard to do that because in order to stay motivated, you sort of have to occasionally just do stuff because it's cool. And I think maybe there are elements of this game, looking at it now, that have followed that principle of just like, I need to keep making what I feel is cool in order to stay motivated to finish this project. And that's why, there are maybe some nuances in the gameplay that could be improved based on some of the stuff I said earlier about feedback and animations and UX and UI design. Maybe should have been improved before all of the extra levels and weapons and stuff were added. But I can also empathize with adding the extra weapons and levels being the cool fun part and wanting to do that. And I think for project management, any kind of creative work, right? If you're a musician or a filmmaker, these things apply as well. You sort of have to budget your attention span and one for them, one for me. You do some quality of life improvement or you fix a bug because you know that it is doing. You don't really want to do it because it's boring. Then you make another weapon and then you do one for them. So that's like, players don't understand this tutorial. I'm going to spend a day making some small improvements to that. I don't want to do it. It's boring. And then the next day now I can do something cool. I'm going to make the explosions better. I think maybe some of us just do that unconsciously of like, we know there are important things that aren't fun to do and we know there are fun things that aren't as important, and maybe if you might just have a very good natural way of jumping between those two priorities, because it is possible to go the other way, right? And I think there are lots of people who get into game development not particularly because they want to make games but because they enjoy programming. And if you're that sort of person, then often you'll end up with the opposite problem of like, you have a game where it's like optimized really well and the code base makes sense and has really good comments in it and stuff, but it's not necessarily anything anyone wants to play because the focus hasn't been on like what's cool or how do I make my game unique, how do I make something that is kind of cool and has enough variety and content in it and stuff. There is no easy fast answer to any of these questions. I'm just thinking out loud about things that I've struggled with when I've done my own projects and things I know that new developers struggle with, and even things that professional developers working in studios struggle with. Order of operations, what's important to get done first. Is it important to like polish and refactor and streamline a game before you even know if anyone really wants to play it, right? But then, is it important to add loads of content to a game, like loads of variations in weapons and play styles before the fundamental things of the game are worked out? If I was going to summarize everything we've touched on in terms of feedback that I think is easy to implement but might improve the game quite a bit, I'd like to see a bit more thought gone into the camera and how far the player can see in different directions. And maybe that's a case of pulling the camera out slightly permanently, or maybe it's a case of pulling the camera out based on some factor, like, the more hurt you get, the more it zooms out so that you have a bit more situational awareness. I think there are lots of little things about the UI that could be improved, like for example moving left to right and attacking enemies on the right hand side of the screen when my weapon status is all in that position feels very strange. I think pushing things up to the edge and having 4 things down the edge instead of 4 things in a square is probably the way to go. You know, the more you push things out, the more you need to draw attention to them when it's relevant. So I think things like flashing the borders of resource, whether it's health or shield or the charge of a weapon, flashing the border with a kind of white and red thing, something to draw attention to out of the corner of your eye, so that players always have that moment-to-moment awareness of which of the abilities can and can't be used, or, you know, how much they need to watch out because their shield is down. Basically pushing all of the HUD out to the edge so that it doesn't get in the way of the gameplay, but then compensating for that by making sure it flashes to alert you out the corner of your eye when you can or can't do something. Relatively simple thing to do here that would improve the overall experience quite a bit. There are lots of little finesses that can be done to the way that animations are handled, and I don't necessarily mean sprite for sprite animations, but things like shaking a character, shaking a projectile, flashing a projectile. So it's quite a good approach that most of the enemy projectiles are that same block yellow, because it gives me a very quick visual shorthand for what to avoid moving around in the level. But I think if they were flashing a little bit between yellow and a brighter yellow, yellow and white, that's going to put them higher up in what we call the information hierarchy. I will do a whole video on information hierarchy at some point, but basically it's a sense of what things can you do to an object in your game world to make it more obvious that it is something you should be focusing on. So in the context of something which is dangerous, making it flash a little bit. I'm not talking about like bullet hell, seizure inducing, but just having it kind of strobe between a yellow and a slightly different yellow, or a yellow and a white, would be really helpful to help pick out those dangerous objects moving around in the environment. And then I think when you have an object that has a timer till it detonates or disappears, having it so it kind of blinks in and out and gets faster as it gets closer to 0 would be really helpful in judging how to deal with things like those blue sticky bombs that stay in place, or the yellow bombs that follow you and then eventually detonate. This is, you know, probably quite universal advice, but particularly for action games. Look for the cases where you can add a visual effect that makes something look cooler and also adds more information for the player to use as they're playing. Whenever you can do that, it's like getting two for one out of that. What's a feature or a tweak that I can develop that does 2 things at once? It makes something look cooler and it provides an extra bit of information. Those small things that are maybe code-driven animation, like making something flash or making it vibrate, those tend to fall in that category, and they are really the lifeblood of, you know, what makes or breaks an action game. VFX that aren't just there to look cool and aren't just there to make the game visually confusing, because that is what happens in bullet hell games, is there are so many VFX that they become part of the game's difficulty, as overwhelming of your senses, which I personally cannot deal with because my brain is not very good at that. But there are ways of using cool flashy VFX that help to make the game easier to understand, and I think that is a thing to focus on here. And then the use of VFX both within the game world and within the HUD to help draw attention to what is happening, whether it's something that needs to be avoided or to highlight a piece of situational information like your shield is down or your weapon needs to recharge. This is going to be the first game that goes into my As Seen in the Indie Game Clinic collection. The first game I reviewed for Indie Game Clinic. It's cool and reminds me of my time in the RoboCorp. Is it Corp with the EP or is it Corp? I don't remember how to spell it because all of the cybernetics messed up the spelling part of my brain. There we go. Sensible. So yeah, as this channel grows and I do more of these, if your game is on itch and I feature it, it's gonna go in that collection As Seen in the Indie Game Clinic, so I will be sharing that as we go along as well.